Oh, that's working. Hello and welcome to all of you to this discussion today. As most of you in this room will know, in October, the 16th of October 2017, Daphne Caruana Galizia was a popular and pioneering journalist, was killed when a bomb under her car exploded. She had been writing about corruption and exposing wrongdoing for years, but the year before, she had started work on the Panama Papers. After her death, her 3 sons carried on her campaign, and last year, her youngest wrote an amazing book. I urge you all to read it, called A Death in Malta, an Assassination and a Family's Quest for Justice. My name is Jane Martinson, and I'm delighted that we have Paul Caruana Galizia here to talk about his book today.
Thank you.
Paul, I'd like to start by asking you, I was struck in the book that your mother achieved and did so much, but you really wrote about her, as well as being an amazing journalist, as a woman and a mother. Can you talk to us about why you wrote the book as you did?
Yeah, so I started on the book at a time when the murder investigation had already gone some way, and her case was in the news a lot. Her stories were still in the news a lot. And I began to feel that her murder had become bigger than her life. And I felt, obviously I felt for personal reasons deeply uncomfortable with that she was seen purely as a murder victim, that people talked about her all the time, but no one really knew her, you know? No one really knew her as a person, as a mother. And I discovered when I was writing the book that I didn't really know much about her either. So that was the main idea, really, to restore some of her life to her.
And after her death, Matthew, I mentioned the Panama Papers, your older brother who is here, and it was on this stage yesterday, in fact, talking about the many abuses against journalists. He had worked with your mother on the Panama Papers, but it actually inspired you too to start working as a journalist.
It did. The funny thing is, I spent most of my 20s, so I was 28 when she was killed, deliberately avoiding journalism because obviously I didn't want to be compared to her. And then Matthew became a journalist, and then that felt strange as well. But in the immediate aftermath of her murder, we were campaigning on her case full time, so none of us were working really. But it of course got to a point where we had to return to work. And I always felt strange going back to an office job, like corporate job. And just by chance, really, I joined a new journalism company, and I've never really looked back since then.
Tortoise, which is Tortoise Media, where we
yes, that's right.
Met each other and
yes.
started working. When you read in the book some of the details of your mother's life, the sort of abuse that she was subject to, the terrible litigation, the dog poisonings, your
yes.
dog growing up, it was very isolated. But what's really inspiring, I think, when you read the book is how in journalism, not only were you 3 brothers really united in the campaign, but also her work carried on. Can you talk about what happened with the Daphne Project and other things?
Yes. So when after she died, we were left in a situation where we knew there were a number of stories she had been working on and obviously never got to finish. And so we were left with all these files, notes, a lot of material. And quite early on, really within a few weeks of her murder, we just decided we had to do something with this material. We couldn't just sit on it. And of course, because Matthew was a journalist and knew other journalists, we got in touch initially with 2 journalists from The Guardian. And we were staying at this safe house, I suppose, at the time, getting security training. It was at this remote house in England. And these Guardian journalists drove up to the house. We met them, we talked to them for ages, and shared some of her material. And later we met Stephen Gray from Reuters and went through the same thing with him. And then we kind of left them to it. You know, we were sources. We had no hold over them, what they were going to do. And that was really the end of 2017 when we last spoke to them. And then by April the following year, we learned, because they began publishing, that they had formed a consortium that they called the Daphne Project. So the Guardian, Reuters, the New York Times, La Repubblica, Le Monde. And they began publishing their first stories in April again. And the amazing thing looking back is this, that one of the first big stories was about an energy privatization deal, which my mother had been investigating. So part of the material we shared was a huge leak of data from this energy company that won a big public contract. And the April reporting revealed what looked like illicit payments between companies connected to this deal. And then towards the end of 2018, so November 2018, they did another round of stories. And there was a really crucial one, again, that we didn't see coming. But that round of reporting revealed the ownership of an offshore company called 17 Black that my mother had been trying to uncover the owner of for the last few months of her life, but never got to. And then a year from that date, so November 2019, the owner of that company, 17 Black, was arrested on suspicion of commissioning her murder.
Could you give us an update on where we are? Because so far, I mean, that was obviously, that was the year after that there was the sort of reaction to the journalism. But before then, you and your brothers had set up the foundation, and in terms of the sort of taking on the sort of fight against corruption, within a week of her death, you were also in court because of the 43 outstanding lawsuits against her. Can you talk about that, and also then we can talk about where we are in terms of justice?
So she was sued a lot. So one man she wrote about sued her 19 times over the same story. At the time of her death, she was facing 47 libel suits. 5 of them were criminal, so we still had criminal libel in Malta at the time. It's since been repealed. And under Maltese law, as a claimant, you can continue seeking damages against the person's estate. So my mother died, leaving us as her heirs to respond to those suits. So, the first hearing, it was a scheduled hearing, was within a week of her murder, and it was a suit filed by the economy minister. And we were put in this position of having to defend these libel suits over my mother's reporting. Of course, we didn't have access to a lot of her sources. We didn't have access to her, most obviously. But a lot of these people did continue suing. And we've fought them down to really just a handful now. But it's taken years. And we are dragged in and out of court for years over these suits.
And where, in terms of, there are 4 men that have pleaded guilty and are in prison. They were the ones who planted the bomb. Can you give us an update on the sort of campaign to bring about justice?
So 3 hitmen have now all pleaded guilty and are serving prison sentences. A 4th man received a pardon in exchange for evidence on the murder. His evidence led to the arrest and charges against Jürgen Fenech, so the man who owned 17 Black.
The sort of mastermind, the business mastermind.
And so we've been waiting for his trial for years now. And there are charges against another 3 men who supplied the bomb.
But no charges against, I think Fenwick had sort of implicated people that were in government, the chief of staff of the then Prime Minister. What's happened in terms of...
So Fenwick, I should have said, Fenwick's corruption scheme involved really senior government officials, so the then Prime Minister's chief of staff and the energy minister. So the scheme was they would award him this energy contract and he would kick back proceeds to their offshore companies. Fenwick implicated them in his various attempts to get a plea deal, which have all failed, and we think that's right. What has emerged in the criminal proceedings is a really extensive and long-running attempted cover-up of the murder. So Schembri, in particular, with the help of others, had been leaking really sensitive information from the murder investigation, including really specific forensic details, and obviously the fact that Fenwick himself was a suspect, to Fenwick continually and in real time over the course of the murder investigation. So the government of the time was involved in the attempt to cover up her murder. And it was an attempt, again, that ran for years. No one has been charged over that attempted cover-up. In fact, no one's really been charged over any of the corruption allegations that she reported on, or even over the Panama Papers, a story she broke in February 2016.
Throughout the book, you talk about the EU at the time when your mother was, the legal cases against her were ratcheting up, the online abuse, the physical abuse. Malta was a member of the EU Council of Europe, but
yes.
Nothing happened, did it? They didn't help until after she died.
Until after. So it was, looking back, it was so obvious what was happening. The abuse, the harassment, it escalated. So even the libel suits we were just talking about, if you plotted them on a graph, and we did this, you see this really rapid escalation up until her murder. The online abuse, you see the same pattern, these kind of coordinated trolling campaigns against her that really intensified towards the end of her life. But no one really did anything. And even after her murder, I mean, it took really intensive campaigning. We called it campaigning, but it was effectively lobbying. So me and my two brothers going to the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and going from one MEP's office or one MP's office to another, just speaking to them, pressing them to do something, to speak up. In the end, that campaign really did bear fruit, but you know what I mean? It was a lot of people. It was us as a family. It was a number of NGOs. It was our lawyers just continually pushing and writing. And I think one really important product of the campaigning was Malta's first public inquiry. So there are two lawyers sitting in the front row who are really crucial in getting that set up. And that public inquiry reported about 2 years ago now and found the Maltese state was responsible for her death and uncovered a lot of really serious, really endemic corruption in the country. But it was really us forcing that through to the Council of Europe that brought pressure down on Malta to convene one.
Before opening up to the audience for questions, there's one thing that we share, a sort of interest and a sort of hatred, really, for the way that transnational organisations, particularly when it comes to money, are sort of able to hide.
Yes.
They make the job of journalism so difficult. They actually make the job of national lawmakers really difficult. Where do you feel we are with that? Has it got worse since your mother's death? Are there ways that are more sort of recognition of it? And should there be?
There should be. I think things have improved in the sense that people now recognize it as a really global problem and that these offshore companies and offshore jurisdictions are really, really toxic vectors of corruption globally. And that's that's the role Malta decided it would play in large part. And that mattered to my mother's life in that she for years went from reporting on corruption on a Maltese level, corrupt politicians, corrupt judges. And when Malta became very attractive as one of these jurisdictions, she suddenly found herself reporting on huge global flows of illicit money. It makes everyone's life harder, except of course for the people who use them. My mother only found that Maltese government officials owned Panama companies because of the Panama Papers leak, which was exceptional in every way. She didn't know who owned 17 Black because that company wasn't in the leak, at least its beneficial ownership data wasn't, so she couldn't. And Fennec, the man who owned it, knew or suspected she might find out who owned it, and so had her killed. And that really tells you what you need to know about these companies, know.
That was listed in UAE, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, in a UAE kind of business jurisdiction, a free trade zone. I don't think anything's really improved in the sense that these jurisdictions still exist. The kind of attempts to control them are really piecemeal. So there's really little use in saying, we're going to stop secrecy in the BVI when Samoa still provides it.
Yeah.
You only need one jurisdiction.
And there's no real attempt to make it a sort of transnational...
No, there isn't.
And given the elections this year, it might not be the year to do it. Now, I've been told there are mics around the floor. If you'd like to ask a question, please put your hand up. And I can... No, I can carry on asking lots of questions, actually, so that's fine. But I'll keep looking out just in case. In terms of sort of the local journalism you talked about, I personally, your mother's story is so inspiring, and the way you write about it is beautiful and heartbreaking. But as a local journalist, that sort of connection to sort of what can be uncovered on a local level.
Yes.
What's so difficult is obviously the local papers it was very difficult to get them to write anything. And although she did have a regular column, she found freedom online with her blog.
Yes, that's right. So in 2008, she set up her own blog, or rather Matthew set it up for her. And that was really a product of her feeling constrained editorially, like she wanted to write more than 2 columns a week. She wanted to do it without an editor she thought to be too conservative. So she started this blog, and it was an amazing thing. It was 2008. There had been nothing like it in Malta, and blogging generally was still quite new, I think, back then. And people just went to it, multiple times a day. So Malta's population around then was around 400,000 people, right? And so her blog, during the election campaign of that year, was receiving as many visits a day, so 400,000 visits to her blog. And she would update it daily, and it just became a central news source, not just a provider, but it would make the news every day during certain periods. But then it meant something else, that it was just her, there wasn't a filter of an editorial board, an organization's lawyers. It was, as the government used to say, one woman and a laptop. And so that really exposed her to enormous legal risk, to really, really horrific online abuse. So as her kind of influence and audience grew, and her reputation with sources grew, so people would come to her increasingly with information, she became more of a target. And, in the end, it's of course telling that she was car-bombed rather than a judge, a magistrate, a police officer, an MP, because it was her, really, that was exposing these allegations, reporting them.
and everyone else seemed, so there were so many sort of
Yeah, so
organizations.
the country was in this like absurd position. Like people were asked to believe two things, you know, that all the corruption she was reporting, but then that it wasn't a problem, because nothing would happen. So she would report that two of the most senior government officials owned offshore companies, but that it wasn't a problem, and it didn't require investigation, and they could remain in post. And that kind of kept up at a really high kind of pitch, you know. She would report one thing after another until she was killed. You know, that was the attempt to stop it.
And that level of corruption, the protests, which still to this day, I know
Yes.
Keelan, your lawyer, one of your lawyers yesterday, that there are still vigils on them.
Yes, there are. So there have been monthly vigils. So one of, I find this the most, in a way, the most important and certainly the most inspiring development. That Malta historically has been a country with little tradition of civil society. So protests were always organized by the main political parties or the church or a trade union. But immediately after her murder, these civil society groups started forming, campaigning for justice, the rule of law. So the vigils are part of that. So there are monthly vigils held in her memory. There are bigger kind of protests on the anniversary of her murder. And that's the kind of change you would hope for. You know, you would want change by public demand, basically. You want people to want it. You want people to demand it. And our campaign has been really about generating that, to kind of take it from a private issue to a public one. So there was one constitutional case we filed to have a really corrupt police officer removed from the murder investigation. And the government resisted it, of course, and wanted the press kept out of the courtroom. And the judge in that case ruled, no, they should stay because the public is an injured party too. And I remember hearing that and thinking, that's it. The public is an injured party too. And I guess that's the significant thing about the murder of a journalist like my mother, that it is a crime. It is a really serious, all crimes are against the public, and this really was that.
Yeah. I know that there's now two. I was going to say there's a woman there, and then this, in the second row as well.
Hi, I'm a journalist based in Malta. I moved there in September 2017, and I've basically experienced Malta post-Daphne.
Okay.
I have my own thoughts on how it's been ever since, and I know that her work has been picked up internationally a lot, like as you mentioned, through the Daphne Project, and there's been a lot of continuation. How do you feel about the void that was left in the media landscape in Malta? Do you think it has been somehow picked up and continued, or do you think there should be more from there?
Yes, I think there should always be more, and I think there are really positive things, like, for example, the growth of entirely new organizations, so the Shift News, for example, it has kind of increased, at least on certain stories, collaboration, which is something that just didn't exist before. So, you know, different media outlets working on the same story together. I think it is really serious and important to say that the risks that my mother faced are still there. So the issues around Maltese libel law, apart from criminal libel, still exist. I think the risks to life are still there. So that is really important to state. So all of the public inquiry's recommendations about generating a media freedom environment haven't been taken up. I wish that the interest from foreign publications would pick up again, because that really mattered in my mother's case. And the corruption allegations are just as serious and still exist.
There was one lady who did want to. Do you have the mic? I was trying to get to, and then we've only got 1 more minute, and then that's it. So a quick response, I'm afraid.
Diana Maynard from the University of Sheffield. We're currently studying how online threats and abuse can escalate to more serious violence. And I'm curious to know more about the effect of the online abuse and threats. And I know it's a kind of impossible question, but if they clearly didn't have the effect that they were intended to of silencing her. But if, for example, the online threats hadn't been there, how might things have turned out differently, do you think?
So the online threats did have a very real effect on her health, on her social life. So she felt really unable to leave the house because every time she did, people would take photos of her and share them online. And the strange thing is this. So growing up, we had arson attacks on the house. She would be harassed in the street. Our dogs were killed. We had a lot of that, people calling up the house. But the thing about the internet is it just kind of industrialized the harassment and abuse. And it was unrelenting. You know, there was never a moment where someone wasn't saying something awful about her. There was never that moment. Under her pieces, over other blogs, you know, websites. There was a blog set up by a government official purely designed to harass her. So the effect on her was really serious, detrimental. And, it was journalists working on the shift, the organization I mentioned, uncovered it was coordinated. You know, there were government officials coordinating these trolling campaigns. On the kind of counterfactual question, I think that online behavior, abuse and harassment normalized the idea that she's a target and normalized the idea that she wasn't a person. You know, it legitimized, in other words, the idea that you could kill her.
Thank you. We could ask and talk for a lot longer, but in the meantime, I'd just like to say thank you all for coming, but thank you mainly to Paul.
Thank you for carrying on. Thank you so much. Thank you.